What if a mystery from the 1930s could still reach out and haunt the present day? A child vanished without a trace in the heart of Chicago, leaving behind whispers, unanswered questions, and a silence that lasted nearly a century. Decades later, when the truth seemed forever buried, modern science uncovered a revelation no one expected. Watch until the end. The past is not done speaking. Chicago, 1930. The city pulsed with jazz clubs, smoky alleys, and a restless crowd fighting through the weight of the Great Depression. In the midst of this chaos lived the Hartman family, clinging to hope like everyone else. Their modest home on the South Side was filled with the laughter of their 2-year-old daughter, Evelyn. She was a child who carried innocence in her eyes, completely unaware of the shadows that loomed just beyond the doorstep. On May 15th, the family's fragile normality was shattered forever. A stranger appeared, dressed with confidence, speaking with disarming warmth, and offering the kind of help that desperate families often prayed for. The visit seemed harmless at first, almost charitable, but within hours, the unimaginable occurred. Evelyn vanished, taken from her home in broad daylight, as if the city itself had conspired to swallow her whole. What began as an ordinary morning soon became a date that would echo through history. The disappearance of little Evelyn Hartman spread through Chicago like wildfire. Neighbors poured into the Hartman home, whispering theories and offering comfort that felt hollow against the family's anguish. The police arrived quickly, but their presence brought more questions than answers. How could a child be taken in broad daylight from her own home without anyone noticing? The streets of Chicago were busy, filled with watchful eyes, yet no one seemed to have seen anything useful. The officers interviewed the mother, who recounted the stranger's calm smile and the promises she made before walking away with Evelyn. To some, it sounded like a cruel trick. To others, it was as if the stranger had vanished into thin air, leaving no footprints, no trail, no witnesses who dared to stand firm. Newspapers seized on the story, printing Evelyn's face across front pages, turning her disappearance into one of the most talked about mysteries of the decade. But for her family, the headlines were only a reminder that she was gone, and silence was all the city seemed to give back. As days turned into weeks, the Hartman family lived in a haze of despair. Detectives followed every lead, but each one dissolved into nothingness. One day, a letter arrived at the Hartman home, written in a shaky hand, claiming Evelyn was safe and being cared for. The words seemed almost merciful, but the police quickly suspected deception. Was it a cruel hoax or a glimpse of the truth? The letter's tone was peculiar, as if someone wanted to keep the family calm while buying time. Handwriting experts were called, but results were inconclusive. The press latched onto the letter, fueling speculation that Evelyn's abductor was playing a long game, taunting both police and family. Every knock at the door sent chills through the Hartmans, who clung to hope with trembling hands. Chicago, a city already drowning in crime and corruption, seemed incapable of protecting its most innocent. Each unanswered question deepened the mystery, turning Evelyn's disappearance into a shadow that no amount of daylight could chase away. Months slipped away, and the once vivid search began to fade into background noise against the chaos of Chicago's crime-ridden streets. Still, the Hartman family refused to let Evelyn's name disappear. Flyers yellowed in windows, her photos stared from lampposts, and the family's desperate pleas echoed in newspapers. Detectives spoke of dead ends, but whispers lingered. A woman seen boarding a train with a child who looked eerily like Evelyn. A stranger spotted wandering near Union Station with a girl, clutching her hand. Each rumor breathed temporary hope, only to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. The police lacked the resources and will to keep chasing ghosts. Chicago was overflowing with gang wars, kidnappings, and bootlegging crimes. Yet, For the Hartmans, nothing mattered more than that missing child. The silence that followed the initial storm of attention was worse than chaos. It was abandonment. Evelyn had not just been taken from her family, she was being erased piece by time itself. By the first anniversary of Evelyn's disappearance, hope had begun to fracture. The Hartman family still clung to faith, but Chicago had largely moved on. The city's papers, once eager to splash her story across front pages, now relegated her name to small blurbs, overshadowed by gangland killings and political scandals. Detectives rotated off the case, leaving only a thin file of statements and unanswered questions. Yet, behind closed doors, Evelyn's mother refused to surrender. She insisted that her daughter was alive somewhere, hidden under a false name, perhaps growing up unaware of the family torn apart in her absence. She visited police precincts, begged private investigators, and wrote letters to officials far beyond Chicago. Each time she was met with polite silence or hollow promises. The world was moving forward, but for the Hartmans, time had stopped on that spring day in 1930. The image of Evelyn's small face haunted them, a reminder that some ghosts are made of flesh and blood, and they do not fade easily. As the years rolled into decades, Evelyn Hartman's name slipped into the realm of whispered folklore. Chicagoans spoke of her disappearance as one of the city's unsolved mysteries, a reminder of how even a child could vanish without justice. The Hartman family aged under the crushing weight of not knowing. Evelyn's mother kept a small box by her bedside, filled with clippings, photographs, and the worn letter that once claimed Evelyn was safe. She read it on sleepless nights, as if the faded ink could still reveal a hidden truth. Neighbors remembered her as the woman who never stopped waiting at the window, her eyes searching every passing child for a familiar face. Police files gathered dust, stored in dark cabinets where forgotten tragedies rested in silence. By the 1950s, the case was officially considered cold, another tragedy lost to time. But for the family, Evelyn was not a memory. She was a wound that never closed, an unanswered question carved into their bloodline. By the 1960s, Evelyn's disappearance had become a ghost story told in hushed tones. Chicago had changed, its skyline rising higher, its streets filled with new faces who had never heard her name. But for those who remembered, the story lingered like an unsolved riddle. Detectives who once worked the case had retired or passed away, leaving only fragmented notes and fading photographs in brittle files. Occasionally, tips resurfaced. Someone in Florida claimed to have met a woman who resembled an older Evelyn. Someone else swore they saw her name on a school record. But nothing could ever be proven. Each lead flickered briefly, then vanished into the void. For the Hartman family, hope transformed into obsession. They wrote to journalists, pleaded with officials, and clung to rumors, but the world no longer listened. Evelyn's face was no longer in newspapers. She was now an echo. Yet the mystery refused to die. Even in silence, the unanswered question pulsed. What truly happened to Evelyn Hartman? Through the 1970s and 1980s, the Hartman family's tragedy lived only in fragments. A brief mention in old crime digests, a faded poster in a box of forgotten belongings, a rumor repeated at late-night gatherings. Chicago had endured waves of violence, corruption, and reinvention, yet Evelyn's case remained a silent scar, untouched by time. For investigators of the new generation, her name was just a file number, an unsolved entry buried beneath thousands of others. Still, every few years, an anonymous caller or a cryptic letter reignited the flame of hope. One tip suggested she had been taken south, raised under a different name. Another claimed she had died within days of her abduction. None could be verified, but each whispered clue reopened wounds. The Hartmans, dwindling in number, carried the weight of uncertainty like a curse. To them, Evelyn was not just a girl lost in 1930. She was a haunting presence, proof that some mysteries never let go, no matter how many decades pass. By the 1990s, the world had changed in ways the Hartman family could never have imagined back in 1930. Chicago was wired with modern surveillance, databases grew larger, and the age of digital records began. For a brief moment, hope flickered again. Cold case units reopened long-forgotten files, and Evelyn's name resurfaced among them. Investigators looked at the old notes with fresh eyes, but the evidence was thin, just a few photographs, scattered reports, and the infamous letter. Yet something new entered the scene: the possibility of DNA testing. Families of the missing across the country began submitting samples, creating connections thought impossible in earlier decades. For the Hartmans, it felt like a final chance, a glimmer of science reaching back through time to pull Evelyn's ghost into the present. But there was still no direct evidence, no body, no confirmation, just the lingering belief that one day truth would emerge from silence. The case remained unresolved, but technology was finally preparing the ground for answers. As the new millennium dawned, the story of Evelyn Hartman seemed destined to remain a closed chapter in Chicago's long history of unsolved mysteries. Yet in hidden corners, the threads of her life were still quietly tugging toward the surface. Advances in forensic genealogy began to shake the foundations of countless cold cases. Families who had waited decades suddenly found answers in the patterns of DNA, a language the past had been whispering all along. The Hartman descendants, though smaller in number, had not given up. They submitted their DNA to new databases, clinging to the faintest hope that somewhere, somehow, Evelyn's bloodline still existed. For years, nothing happened. The silence felt familiar, heavy, unbreakable. But unlike before, this silence was not the end. It was the tension before the storm. Unbeknownst to the family, their sample had already begun to connect dots no detective ever could. The answer that had eluded them for nearly a century was finally on the horizon, waiting to be uncovered. In the early 2000s, forensic genealogy shifted from a distant possibility to a powerful weapon. Cases once thought unsolvable were suddenly being reopened, names restored to the missing, and families given long-denied answers. It was during this wave of breakthroughs that Evelyn Hartman's file resurfaced, not through police work, but through bloodlines. A DNA submission from one of her living relatives created a faint match in an expanding database. At first, it seemed almost impossible. After all, Evelyn had vanished 70 years earlier with no trace. Yet, when genealogists followed the genetic threads, they began to uncover a connection to a woman who had lived quietly in Florida under a different name. This discovery sent chills through the investigators. If true, it meant Evelyn had never left this world as a ghost. She had lived an entire life hidden in plain sight. What remained unknown was how she got there and why her family had been left in darkness for so long. The genetic trail led to a woman named Jeanette Burchard, but in this story we will call her Clara Dawson. Clara had lived most of her life in Florida, far from the streets of Chicago where Evelyn Hartman had vanished in 1930. She was known by neighbors as quiet, polite, and unremarkable, the kind of person who blended into the background of small-town life. She married, raised children, and carried herself with no indication of the storm that lay hidden in her past. When investigators compared her descendants' DNA to the Hartman family, the match was undeniable. Clara Dawson was, in truth, Evelyn Hartman. The revelation was staggering. The child who had fueled headlines in the 1930s had grown up under a different name, lived a full life, and died in 2003 without ever knowing her true origins. The discovery solved the riddle of identity, but not the deeper mystery. Who had taken her and why had she been hidden for so long? When the confirmation finally came, the Hartman descendants were struck by a tidal wave of emotions. Relief, sorrow, and anger collided in ways words could barely contain. After more than 90 years of silence, they finally knew Evelyn had lived, but not with them, not under their name, not with the family that had searched endlessly for her. She had built a life as Clara Dawson in Florida, far removed from the pain that had consumed her true relatives. For some in the family, the revelation was bittersweet. They were grateful she had not died as a child, that she had grown, married, and known love. For others, it was a cruel twist of fate. Proof that she had been within reach of the truth all along, yet forever kept apart. The knowledge did not erase the years of grief, nor the hollow places left by generations of waiting. Instead, it reopened the wound in a different way, showing them the life that could have been theirs, but never was. The revelation that Clara Dawson was truly Evelyn Hartman answered one question, but unearthed countless more. Who had taken her from Chicago in 1930? Was it the mysterious woman who charmed her mother with promises of help? If so, why? No police file revealed her true identity, and no surviving witnesses could provide clarity. Had Evelyn been sold, hidden, or perhaps raised by someone who believed they were rescuing her? The truth was buried, with the people who orchestrated the abduction. Even more chilling was the silence. Clara herself never seemed to know she was Evelyn. She lived her entire life unaware of the history written in newspapers, the family who never stopped searching, the wound her absence carved into Chicago's memory. Investigators were left staring at the gap in time, a black hole stretching from 1930 to her death in 2003. Science could trace her blood, but it could not explain the motives, nor the shadows that had stolen a child and erased her name. News of the discovery rippled through Chicago like a long-delayed echo. For the city, Evelyn Hartman's case had been one of its earliest and most haunting mysteries, a reminder of the vulnerability of children in an unforgiving era. When modern DNA revealed that she had lived under the name Clara Dawson in Florida, the story was resurrected, not as a tragedy without end, but as a chilling reminder of how secrets can outlive entire generations. Journalists revisited yellowed newspapers, piecing together the narrative that had once captivated the public. For investigators, it was both a triumph and a frustration. The science had given them an answer, but not the full truth. Communities long fascinated by unsolved crimes were transfixed by the idea that a girl snatched in 1930 had lived an ordinary life, hidden in plain sight. For the Hartman descendants, the city's attention was bittersweet. It felt like the world was finally listening again, but almost a century too late. For Evelyn's descendants, the revelation was both a gift and a torment. They had inherited a legacy of unanswered questions, passed down like a family heirloom from generation to generation. Stories of the missing child had become almost mythical within the Hartman bloodline. Tales told at gatherings, reminders of a wound that never closed. When the DNA results confirmed that Evelyn had lived as Clara Dawson, the myth shattered into a harsh reality. They now knew she had grown old, had children and grandchildren, and yet none of them had ever known who she truly was. The idea that Evelyn had lived a full life while her family withered in grief left a complicated ache. Joy that she had survived, sorrow that they were strangers to her, and anger at the theft of nearly a century of love. It was closure of one kind, but not the closure they had prayed for. It felt like opening a locked door, only to find another wall behind it. The revelation reignited debates, not only within the Hartman family, but across communities fascinated by unresolved crimes. What does justice mean when the victim has lived a full life, never knowing her true identity? Some argued that Evelyn's survival was the only justice possible, proof that even in tragedy, life had found a way forward. Others insisted that justice had been denied, her abductor had escaped accountability, and her family had endured generations of anguish. Scholars and journalists reflected on how fragile memory can be, how a child's disappearance can slip from public consciousness until only the family keeps the flame alive. Evelyn's case revealed how the past can be rewritten, not by confessions or courtroom verdicts, but by the silent evidence hidden in blood. It was a reminder that history is never truly buried, that forgotten crimes can return to demand attention, and that some answers arrive too late to heal, but never too late to haunt. Modern investigators reviewing the Hartman case could not help but reflect on the failures of the past. In 1930, police had little forensic science, few resources, and were overwhelmed by Chicago's crime wave. Kidnappings were often treated with skepticism, and unless ransom was demanded, cases sometimes slipped into neglect. Detectives relied on witness testimony and intuition, tools fragile against a cunning abductor. Looking back, many believe that Evelyn's disappearance might have been preventable, had there been broader communication between states, stronger tracking of train passengers, or more thorough preservation of evidence. Instead, what remained were fragments, a shaky letter, fading memories, and unanswered questions. The irony was undeniable. The tools that could have saved her identity, DNA, databases, forensic genealogy, arrived decades too late, when Evelyn herself had already lived and died under another name. For modern investigators, the case was both a breakthrough and a cautionary tale, proof that silence is not the same as resolution. As the truth settled in, the Hartman story became more than a family tragedy. It became a symbol of how time can both bury and reveal secrets. For nearly a century, Evelyn's name had lingered in the shadows, her image frozen as a lost child. Now the world knew she had grown, lived, and died as Clara Dawson, unaware of the stolen identity that defined her existence. Yet the unanswered questions screamed louder than the revelation itself. Who was the woman who took her from Chicago? Was Evelyn raised in deception, or did she grow believing her past had always been Florida? The silence of the abductor left the narrative unfinished, a puzzle with missing pieces. What endured was the chilling reminder that truth does not erase suffering. It only reframes it. For the Hartmans, the answer brought peace, but never justice. For the rest of us, Evelyn's story stood as proof that the past can whisper through bloodlines, refusing to be forgotten. In the end, Evelyn Hartman's story remains a paradox, solved, yet forever unsolved. DNA revealed her fate, but not the truth of her abduction. She lived an ordinary life in Florida as Clara Dawson, never knowing the storm her disappearance had unleashed in Chicago. For her descendants, the discovery was both a blessing and a curse. They had found her, but they could never reclaim the lost years. For the city, it was a reminder that even the deepest mysteries can claw their way back into the present. And for all who hear her story, it lingers as a warning. Time may bury evidence, silence voices, and turn pain into legend, but it does not erase truth. Somewhere in the shadows of history, someone once held the answers and chose to vanish with them. Evelyn's case closes with science but not with justice, and that is the haunting legacy that refuses to die.